Chapter 24 of the Blithedale Romance. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel HAWTHORNE. Chapter 24. The Masqueraders. 2 nights had passed since the foregoing occurrences, when in a breezy September forenoon I set forth from town on foot towards Blithedale. It was the most delightful of all days for a walk, with a dash of invigorating ice temper in the air, but a coolness that soon gave place to the brisk glow of exercise, while the vigor remained as elastic as before. The atmosphere had a spirit and a sparkle in it. Each breath was like a sip of ethereal wine, tempered, as I said, with a crystal lump of ice. I had started on this expedition in an exceedingly sombre mood, as well befitted one who found himself tending towards home, but was conscious that nobody would be quite overjoyed to greet him there. My feet were hardly off the pavement, however, when this morbid sensation began to yield to the lively influences of air and motion. Nor had I gone far, with the fields yet green on either side, before my step became as swift and light as if Hollingsworth were waiting to exchange a friendly hand grip, and Zenobia's and Priscilla's open arms would welcome the wanderer's reappearance. It has happened to me on other occasions, as well as this, to prove how a state of physical well-being can create a kind of joy, in spite of the profoundest anxiety of mind. The pathway of that walk still runs along with sunny freshness through my memory. I know not why it should be so, but my mental eye can even now discern the September grass, bordering the pleasant roadside with a brighter verdure than while the summer heats were scorching it. The trees, too, mostly green, although here and there a branch or shrub has donned its vesture of crimson and gold a week or two before its fellows. I see the tufted barberry bushes with their small clusters of scarlet fruit, the toadstools likewise, some spotlessly white, others yellow or red, mysterious growths, springing suddenly from no root or seed, and growing nobody can tell how or wherefore. In this respect they resembled many of the emotions in my breast. And I still see the little rivulets, chill, clear, and bright, that murmured beneath the road through subterranean rocks, and deepened into mossy pools where tiny fish were darting to and fro, and within which lurked the hermit frog. But no, I never can account for it, that, with a yearning interest to learn the upshot of all my story, and returning to Blithedale for that sole purpose, I should examine these things so like a peaceful bosomed naturalist; nor why, amid all my sympathies and fears, there shot at times a wild exhilaration through my frame. Thus I pursued my way along the line of the ancient stone wall that Paul Dudley built, and through white villages, and past orchards of ruddy apples, and fields of ripening maize, and patches of woodland, and all such sweet rural scenery as looks the fairest a little beyond the suburbs of a town. Hollingsworth, Zenobia, Priscilla, they glided mistily before me as I walked. Sometimes, in my solitude, I laughed with the bitterness of self-scorn, remembering how unreservedly I had given up my heart and soul to interests that were not mine. What had I ever had to do with them? And why, being now free, should I take this thraldom on me once again? It was both sad and dangerous, I whispered to myself, to be in too close affinity with the passions, the errors, and the misfortunes of individuals who stood within a circle of their own, into which, if I stepped at all, it must be as an intruder, and at a peril that I could not estimate. Drawing nearer to Blithedale, a sickness of the spirits kept alternating with my flights of causeless buoyancy. I indulged in 100 odd and extravagant conjectures. Either there was no such place as Blithedale, nor ever had been, nor any brotherhood of thoughtful laborers, like what I seemed to recollect there, or else it was all changed during my absence. It had been nothing but dream work and enchantment. I should seek in vain for the old farmhouse, and for the greensward, the potato fields, the root crops, and acres of Indian corn, and for all that configuration of the land which I had imagined. It would be another spot, and an utter strangeness. These vagaries were of the spectral throng so apt to steal out of an unquiet heart. They partly ceased to haunt me on my arriving at a point whence, through the trees, I began to catch glimpses of the Blithedale farm. That surely was something real. There was hardly a square foot of all those acres on which I had not trodden heavily in one or another kind of toil. The curse of Adam's posterity, and, curse or blessing be it, it gives substance to the life around us, had first come upon me there. In the sweat of my brow I had there earned bread and eaten it, and so established my claim to be on earth, and my fellowship with all the sons of labor. I could have knelt down and have laid my breast against that soil. The red clay of which my frame was molded seemed nearer akin to those crumbling furrows than to any other portion of the world's dust. There was my home, and there might be my grave. I felt an invincible reluctance, nevertheless, at the idea of presenting myself before my old associates, without first ascertaining the state in which they were. A nameless foreboding weighed upon me. Perhaps, should I know all the circumstances that had occurred, I might find it my wisest course to turn back, unrecognized, unseen, and never look at Blithedale more. Had it been evening, I would have stolen softly to some lighted window of the old farmhouse, and peeped darkling in, to see all their well known faces round the supper board. Then, were there a vacant seat, I might noiselessly unclose the door, glide in, and take my place among them without a word. My entrance might be so quiet, my aspect so familiar, that they would forget how long I had been away, and suffer me to melt into the scene, as a wreath of vapor melts into a larger cloud. I dreaded a boisterous greeting. Beholding me at table, Zenobia, as a matter of course, would send me a cup of tea, and Hollingsworth fill my plate from the great dish of pandowdy, and Priscilla, in her quiet way, would hand the cream, and others help me to the bread and butter. Being one of them again, the knowledge of what had happened would come to me without a shock. For still, at every turn of my shifting fantasies, the thought stared me in the face that some evil thing had befallen us, or was ready to befall. Yielding to this ominous impression, I now turned aside into the woods, resolving to spy out the posture of the community as craftily as the wild Indian before he makes his onset. I would go wandering about the outskirts of the farm, and, perhaps catching sight of a solitary acquaintance, would approach him amid the brown shadows of the trees, a kind of medium fit for spirits departed and revisitant like myself, and entreat him to tell me how all things were. The first living creature that I met was a partridge, which sprung up beneath my feet and whirred away. The next was a squirrel, who chattered angrily at me from an overhanging bough. I trod along by the dark, sluggish river, and remember pausing on the bank, above one of its blackest and most placid pools. The very spot, with the barkless stump of a tree aslantwise over the water, is depicting itself to my fancy at this instant, and wondering how deep it was, and if any overladen soul had ever flung its weight of mortality in thither, and if it thus escaped the burden, or only made it heavier. And perhaps the skeleton of the drowned wretch still lay beneath the inscrutable depth, clinging to some sunken log at the bottom with the gripe of its old despair. So slight, however, was the track of these gloomy ideas, that I soon forgot them in the contemplation of a brood of wild ducks which were floating on the river, and anon took flight, leaving each a bright streak over the black surface. By and by I came to my hermitage in the heart of the white pine tree, and, clambering up into it, sat down to rest. The grapes which I had watched throughout the summer now dangled around me in abundant clusters of the deepest purple, deliciously sweet to the taste, and, though wild, yet free from that ungentle flavor which distinguishes nearly all our native and uncultivated grapes. Methought a wine might be pressed out of them possessing a passionate zest, and endowed with a new kind of intoxicating quality, attended with such bacchanalian ecstasies as the tamer grapes of Madeira, France, and the Rhine are inadequate to produce. And I longed to quaff a great goblet of it at that moment. While devouring the grapes, I looked on all sides out of the peepholes of my hermitage, and saw the farmhouse, the fields, and almost every part of our domain, but not a single human figure in the landscape. Some of the windows of the house were open, but with no more signs of life than in a dead man's unshut eyes. The barn door was ajar, and swinging in the breeze. The big old dog, he was a relic of the former dynasty of the farm, that hardly ever stirred out of the yard, was nowhere to be seen. What, then, had become of all the fraternity and sisterhood? Curious to ascertain this point, I let myself down out of the tree, and, going to the edge of the wood, was glad to perceive our herd of cows chewing the cud or grazing not far off. I fancied by their manner that 2 or 3 of them recognized me, as indeed they ought, for I had milked them and been their chamberlain times without number; but after staring me in the face a little while, they phlegmatically began grazing and chewing their cuds again. Then I grew foolishly angry at so cold a reception, and flung some rotten fragments of an old stump at these unsentimental cows. Skirting farther round the pasture, I heard voices and much laughter proceeding from the interior of the wood. Voices, male and feminine; laughter not only of fresh young throats, but the bass of grown people, as if solemn pipe organs should pour out airs of merriment. Not a voice spoke but I knew it better than my own; not a laugh but its cadences were familiar. The wood, in this portion of it, seemed as full of jollity as if Comus and his crew were holding their revels in one of its usually lonesome glades. Stealing onward as far as I durst, without hazard of discovery, I saw a concourse of strange figures beneath the overshadowing branches. They appeared and vanished, and came again confusedly, with the streaks of sunlight glimmering down upon them. Among them was an Indian chief, with blanket, feathers, and war paint, and uplifted tomahawk; and near him, looking fit to be his woodland bride, the goddess Diana, with the crescent on her head, and attended by our big lazy dog, in lack of any fleeter hound. Drawing an arrow from her quiver, she let it fly at a venture, and hit the very tree behind which I happened to be lurking. Another group consisted of a Bavarian broom girl, a negro of the Jim Crow order, 1 or 2 foresters of the Middle Ages, a Kentucky woodsman in his trimmed hunting shirt and deerskin leggings, and a Shaker elder, quaint, demure, broad-brimmed, and square-skirted. Shepherds of Arcadia and allegoric figures from the Faery Queen were oddly mixed up with these. Arm in arm, or otherwise huddled together in strange discrepancy, stood grim Puritans, gay cavaliers, and Revolutionary officers with 3-cornered cocked hats and queues longer than their swords. A bright complexioned, dark-haired, vivacious little gypsy, with a red shawl over her head, went from one group to another telling fortunes by palmistry; and Moll Pitcher, the renowned old witch of Lynn, broomstick in hand, showed herself prominently in the midst, as if announcing all these apparitions to be the offspring of her necromantic art. But Silas Foster, who leaned against a tree near by, in his customary blue frock, and smoking a short pipe, did more to disenchant the scene with his look of shrewd, acrid Yankee observation, than 20 witches and necromancers could have done in the way of rendering it weird and fantastic. A little farther off, some old-fashioned skinkers and drawers, all with portentously red noses, were spreading a banquet on the leaf-strewn earth, while a horned and long-tailed gentleman, in whom I recognized the fiendish musician erst seen by Tam O'Shanter, tuned his fiddle, and summoned the whole motley rout to a dance, before partaking of the festal cheer. So they joined hands in a circle, whirling round so swiftly, so madly, and so merrily, in time and tune with the satanic music, that their separate incongruities were blended all together, and they became a kind of entanglement that went nigh to turn one's brain with merely looking at it. Anon they stopped all of a sudden, and, staring at one another's figures, set up a roar of laughter, whereat a shower of the September leaves, which all day long had been hesitating whether to fall or no, were shaken off by the movement of the air, and came eddying down upon the revellers. Then, for lack of breath, ensued a silence, at the deepest point of which, tickled by the oddity of surprising my grave associates in this masquerading trim, I could not possibly refrain from a burst of laughter on my own separate account. "Hush!" I heard the pretty gypsy fortune teller say. "Who is that laughing?" "Some profane intruder," said the goddess Diana. "I shall send an arrow through his heart, or change him into a stag, as I did Actaeon, if he peeps from behind the trees." "Me take his scalp!" cried the Indian chief, brandishing his tomahawk, and cutting a great caper in the air. "I'll root him in the earth with a spell that I have at my tongue's end," squeaked Moll Pitcher, "and the green moss shall grow all over him before he gets free again." "The voice was Miles Coverdale's," said the fiendish fiddler, with a whisk of his tail and a toss of his horns. "My music has brought him hither. He is always ready to dance to the devil's tune." Thus put on the right track, they all recognized the voice at once, and set up a simultaneous shout. "Miles! Miles! Miles Coverdale, where are you?" they cried. "Zenobia! Queen Zenobia! Here is one of your vassals, lurking in the wood. Command him to approach, and pay his duty." The whole fantastic rabble forthwith streamed off in pursuit of me, so that I was like a mad poet hunted by chimeras. Having fairly the start of them, however, I succeeded in making my escape, and soon left their merriment and riot at a good distance in the rear. Its fainter tones assumed a kind of mournfulness, and were finally lost in the hush and solemnity of the wood. In my haste, I stumbled over a heap of logs and sticks that had been cut for firewood a great while ago by some former possessor of the soil, and piled up square in order to be carted or sledded away to the farmhouse. But being forgotten, they had lain there perhaps 50 years, and possibly much longer, until, by the accumulation of moss, and the leaves falling over them and decaying there from autumn to autumn, a green mound was formed, in which the softened outline of the woodpile was still perceptible. In the fitful mood that then swayed my mind, I found something strangely affecting in this simple circumstance. I imagined the long-dead woodman and his long-dead wife and children coming out of their chill graves, and essaying to make a fire with this heap of mossy fuel. From this spot I strayed onward, quite lost in reverie, and neither knew nor cared whither I was going, until a low, soft, well-remembered voice spoke at a little distance. "There is Mr. Coverdale." "Miles Coverdale," said another voice, and its tones were very stern. "Let him come forward, then." "Yes, Mr. Coverdale," cried a woman's voice, clear and melodious, but just then with something unnatural in its chord. "You are welcome. But you come half an hour too late, and have missed a scene which you would have enjoyed." I looked up, and found myself nigh Eliot's pulpit, at the base of which sat Hollingsworth, with Priscilla at his feet, and Zenobia standing before them. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of the Blithedale Romance. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne, Chapter 25, The Three Together. Hollingsworth was in his ordinary working dress. Priscilla wore a pretty and simple gown with a kerchief about her neck, and a calash which she had flung back from her head, leaving it suspended by the strings. But Zenobia, whose part among the maskers, as may be supposed, was no inferior one, appeared in a costume of fanciful magnificence, with her jewelled flower as the central ornament of what resembled a leafy crown or coronet. She represented the Oriental princess by whose name we were accustomed to know her. Her attitude was free and noble, yet if a queen's, it was not that of a queen triumphant, but dethroned, on trial for her life, or, perchance, condemned already. The spirit of the conflict seemed, nevertheless, to be alive in her. Her eyes were on fire, her cheeks had each a crimson spot, so exceedingly vivid, and marked with so definite an outline, that I at first doubted whether it were not artificial. In a very brief space, however, this idea was shamed by the paleness that ensued, as the blood sunk suddenly away. Zenobia now looked like marble. One always feels the fact in an instant when he is intruded on those who love or those who hate, at some acme of their passion that puts them into a sphere of their own, where no other spirit can pretend to stand on equal ground with them. I was confused, affected even with a species of terror, and wished myself away. The intenseness of their feelings gave them the exclusive property of the soil and atmosphere, and left me no right to be or breathe there. "Hollingsworth, Zenobia, I have just returned to Blithedale," said I, "and had no thought of finding you here. We shall meet again at the house. I will retire." "This place is free to you," answered Hollingsworth. "As free as to ourselves," added Zenobia. "This long while past you have been following up your game, groping for human emotions in the dark corners of the heart. Had you been here a little sooner, you might have seen them dragged into the daylight. I could even wish to have my trial over again, with you standing by to see fair play. Do you know, Mr. Coverdale, I have been on trial for my life?" She laughed while speaking thus; but in truth, as my eyes wandered from one of the group to another, I saw in Hollingsworth all that an artist could desire for the grim portrait of a Puritan magistrate, holding inquest of life and death in a case of witchcraft. In Zenobia, the sorceress herself, not aged, wrinkled, and decrepit, but fair enough to tempt Satan with a force reciprocal to his own; and in Priscilla, the pale victim whose soul and body had been wasted by her spells. Had a pile of fagots been heaped against the rock, this hint of impending doom would have completed the suggestive picture. "It was too hard upon me," continued Zenobia, addressing Hollingsworth, "that judge, jury, and accuser should all be comprehended in one man. I demur, as I think the lawyers say, to the jurisdiction. But let the learned Judge Coverdale seat himself on the top of the rock, and you and me stand at its base side by side, pleading our cause before him. There might at least be two criminals instead of one." "You forced this on me," replied Hollingsworth, looking her sternly in the face. "Did I call you hither from among the masqueraders yonder? Do I assume to be your judge? No, except as far as I have an unquestionable right of judgment, in order to settle my own line of behavior towards those with whom the events of life bring me in contact. True, I have already judged you, but not on the world's part, neither do I pretend to pass a sentence." "Ah, this is very good!" cried Zenobia, with a smile. "What strange beings you men are, Mr. Coverdale, is it not so? It is the simplest thing in the world with you to bring a woman before your secret tribunals, and judge and condemn her unheard, and then tell her to go free without a sentence. The misfortune is that this same secret tribunal chances to be the only judgment seat that a true woman stands in awe of, and that any verdict short of acquittal is equivalent to a death sentence." The more I looked at them, and the more I heard, the stronger grew my impression that a crisis had just come and gone. On Hollingsworth's brow it had left a stamp like that of irrevocable doom, of which his own will was the instrument. In Zenobia's whole person, beholding her more closely, I saw a riotous agitation, the almost delirious disquietude of a great struggle, at the close of which the vanquished one felt her strength and courage still mighty within her, and longed to renew the contest. My sensations were as if I had come upon a battlefield before the smoke was as yet cleared away. And what subjects had been discussed here? All, no doubt, that for so many months past had kept my heart and my imagination idly feverish. Zenobia's whole character and history, the true nature of her mysterious connection with Westervelt, her later purposes towards Hollingsworth, and reciprocally his in reference to her, and finally the degree in which Zenobia had been cognizant of the plot against Priscilla, and what at last had been the real object of that scheme. On these points, as before, I was left to my own conjectures. One thing only was certain: Zenobia and Hollingsworth were friends no longer. If their heartstrings were ever intertwined, the knot had been adjudged an entanglement, and was now violently broken. But Zenobia seemed unable to rest content with the matter in the posture which it had assumed. "Ah, do we part so?" exclaimed she, seeing Hollingsworth about to retire. "And why not?" said he, with almost rude abruptness. "What is there further to be said between us?" "Well, perhaps nothing," answered Zenobia, looking him in the face, and smiling. "But we have come many times before to this gray rock, and we have talked very softly among the whisperings of the birch trees. They were pleasant hours. I love to make the latest of them, though not altogether so delightful, loiter away as slowly as may be. And besides, you have put many queries to me at this which you design to be our last interview, and being driven, as I must acknowledge, into a corner, I have responded with reasonable frankness. But now, with your free consent, I desire the privilege of asking a few questions in my turn." "I have no concealment," said Hollingsworth. "We shall see," answered Zenobia. "I would first inquire whether you have supposed me to be wealthy." "On that point," observed Hollingsworth, "I have had the opinion which the world holds." "And I held it likewise," said Zenobia. "Had I not, Heaven is my witness, the knowledge should have been as free to you as me. It is only 3 days since I knew the strange fact that threatens to make me poor; and your own acquaintance with it, I suspect, is of at least as old a date. I fancied myself affluent. You are aware, too, of the disposition which I purposed making of the larger portion of my imaginary opulence. Nay, were it all, I had not hesitated. Let me ask you further, did I ever propose or intimate any terms of compact on which depended this, as the world would consider it, so important sacrifice?" "You certainly spoke of none," said Hollingsworth. "Nor meant any," she responded. "I was willing to realize your dream freely, generously, as some might think, but at all events fully, and heedless though it should prove the ruin of my fortune. If, in your own thoughts, you have imposed any conditions of this expenditure, it is you that must be held responsible for whatever is sordid and unworthy in them. And now one other question. Do you love this girl?" "O Zenobia!" exclaimed Priscilla, shrinking back as if looking for the rock to topple over and hide her. "Do you love her?" repeated Zenobia. "Had you asked me that question a short time since," replied Hollingsworth, after a pause, during which it seemed to me even the birch trees held their whispering breath, "I should have told you no. My feelings for Priscilla differed little from those of an elder brother, watching tenderly over the gentle sister whom God has given him to protect." "And what is your answer now?" persisted Zenobia. "I do love her," said Hollingsworth, uttering the words with a deep inward breath, instead of speaking them outright. "As well declare it thus as in any other way. I do love her." "Now God be judge between us," cried Zenobia, breaking into sudden passion. "Which of us two has most mortally offended him? At least, I am a woman with every fault it may be that a woman ever had, weak, vain, unprincipled, like most of my sex, for our virtues, when we have any, are merely impulsive and intuitive, passionate, too, and pursuing my foolish and unattainable ends by indirect and cunning, though absurdly chosen, means, as an hereditary bond slave must; false, moreover, to the whole circle of good, in my reckless truth to the little good I saw before me; but still a woman, a creature whom only a little change of earthly fortune, a little kinder smile of him who sent me hither, and one true heart to encourage and direct me, might have made all that a woman can be. But how is it with you? Are you a man? No, but a monster, a cold, heartless, self-beginning and self-ending piece of mechanism." "With what, then, do you charge me?" asked Hollingsworth, aghast, and greatly disturbed by this attack. "Show me one selfish end in all I ever aimed at, and you may cut it out of my bosom with a knife." "It is all self," answered Zenobia, with still intenser bitterness. "Nothing else, nothing but self, self, self! The fiend, I doubt not, has made his choicest mirth of you these 7 years past, and especially in the mad summer which we have spent together. I see it now. I am awake, disenchanted, disenthralled. Self, self, self! You have embodied yourself in a project. You are a better masquerader than the witches and gypsies yonder, for your disguise is a self-deception. See whither it has brought you. First, you aimed a death blow, and a treacherous one, at this scheme of a purer and higher life, which so many noble spirits had wrought out. Then, because Coverdale could not be quite your slave, you threw him ruthlessly away. And you took me, too, into your plan, as long as there was hope of my being available, and now fling me aside again, a broken tool. But foremost and blackest of your sins, you stifled down your inmost consciousness. You did a deadly wrong to your own heart. You were ready to sacrifice this girl, whom, if God ever visibly showed a purpose, he put into your charge, and through whom he was striving to redeem you." "This is a woman's view," said Hollingsworth, growing deadly pale, "a woman's, whose whole sphere of action is in the heart, and who can conceive of no higher nor wider one." "Be silent!" cried Zenobia imperiously. "You know neither man nor woman. The utmost that can be said in your behalf, and because I would not be wholly despicable in my own eyes, but would fain excuse my wasted feelings, nor own it wholly a delusion, therefore I say it, is that a great and rich heart has been ruined in your breast. Leave me now. You have done with me, and I with you. Farewell!" "Priscilla," said Hollingsworth, "come." Zenobia smiled. Possibly I did so, too. Not often, in human life, has a gnawing sense of injury found a sweeter morsel of revenge than was conveyed in the tone with which Hollingsworth spoke those 2 words. It was the abased and tremulous tone of a man whose faith in himself was shaken, and who sought at last to lean on an affection. Yes, the strong man bowed himself and rested on this poor Priscilla. Oh, could she have failed him, what a triumph for the lookers on! And at first I half imagined that she was about to fail him. She rose up, stood shivering like the birch leaves that trembled over her head, and then slowly tottered rather than walked towards Zenobia. Arriving at her feet, she sank down there, in the very same attitude which she had assumed on their first meeting, in the kitchen of the old farmhouse. Zenobia remembered it. "Ah, Priscilla," said she, shaking her head, "how much is changed since then! You kneel to a dethroned princess, you, the victorious one. But he is waiting for you. Say what you wish, and leave me." "We are sisters," gasped Priscilla. I fancied that I understood the word and action. It meant the offering of herself and all she had, to be at Zenobia's disposal. But the latter would not take it thus. "True, we are sisters," she replied, and, moved by the sweet word, she stooped down and kissed Priscilla, but not lovingly, for a sense of fatal harm received through her seemed to be lurking in Zenobia's heart. "We had one father. You knew it from the first, I but a little while. Else some things that have chanced might have been spared you. But I never wished you harm. You stood between me and an end which I desired. I wanted a clear path. No matter what I meant. It is over now. Do you forgive me?" "O Zenobia," sobbed Priscilla, "it is I that feel like the guilty one." "No, no, poor little thing," said Zenobia, with a sort of contempt. "You have been my evil fate, but there never was a babe with less strength or will to do an injury. Poor child, methinks you have but a melancholy lot before you, sitting all alone in that wide, cheerless heart, where, for aught you know, and as I, alas, believe, the fire which you have kindled may soon go out. Ah, the thought makes me shiver for you. What will you do, Priscilla, when you find no spark among the ashes?" "Die," she answered. "That was well said," responded Zenobia, with an approving smile. "There is all a woman in your little compass, my poor sister. Meanwhile, go with him and live." She waved her away with a queenly gesture, and turned her own face to the rock. I watched Priscilla, wondering what judgment she would pass between Zenobia and Hollingsworth, how interpret his behavior so as to reconcile it with true faith both towards her sister and herself, how compel her love for him to keep any terms whatever with her sisterly affection. But in truth there was no such difficulty as I imagined. Her engrossing love made it all clear. Hollingsworth could have no fault. That was the one principle at the centre of the universe. And the doubtful guilt or possible integrity of other people, appearances, self-evident facts, the testimony of her own senses, even Hollingsworth's self-accusation, had he volunteered it, would have weighed not the value of a mote of thistledown on the other side. So secure was she of his right, that she never thought of comparing it with another's wrong, but left the latter to itself. Hollingsworth drew her arm within his, and soon disappeared with her among the trees. I cannot imagine how Zenobia knew when they were out of sight; she never glanced again towards them. But retaining a proud attitude so long as they might have thrown back a retiring look, they were no sooner departed, utterly departed, than she began slowly to sink down. It was as if a great, invisible, irresistible weight were pressing her to the earth. Settling upon her knees, she leaned her forehead against the rock, and sobbed convulsively. Dry sobs they seemed to be, such as have nothing to do with tears. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of the Blithedale Romance. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Chapter 26. Zenobia and Coverdale. Zenobia had entirely forgotten me. She fancied herself alone with her great grief. And had it been only a common pity that I felt for her, the pity that her proud nature would have repelled as the one worst wrong which the world yet held in reserve, the sacredness and awfulness of the crisis might have impelled me to steal away silently, so that not a dry leaf should rustle under my feet. I would have left her there to struggle, in that solitude, with only the eye of God upon her. But so it happened, I never once dreamed of questioning my right to be there now, as I had questioned it just before, when I came so suddenly upon Hollingsworth and herself, in the passion of their recent debate. It suits me not to explain what was the analogy that I saw or imagined between Zenobia's situation and mine. Nor, I believe, will the reader detect this one secret, hidden beneath many a revelation which perhaps concerned me less. In simple truth, however, as Zenobia leaned her forehead against the rock, shaken with that tearless agony, it seemed to me that the selfsame pang, with hardly mitigated torment, leaped thrilling from her heartstrings to my own. Was it wrong, therefore, if I felt myself consecrated to the priesthood by sympathy like this, and called upon to minister to this woman's affliction, so far as mortal could? But, indeed, what could mortal do for her? Nothing. The attempt would be a mockery and an anguish. Time, it is true, would steal away her grief, and bury it and the best of her heart in the same grave. But destiny itself, methought, in its kindliest mood, could do no better for Zenobia, in the way of quick relief, than to cause the impending rock to impend a little farther, and fall upon her head. So I leaned against a tree, and listened to her sobs in unbroken silence. She was half prostrate, half kneeling, with her forehead still pressed against the rock. Her sobs were the only sound. She did not groan, nor give any other utterance to her distress. It was all involuntary. At length she sat up, put back her hair, and stared about her with a bewildered aspect, as if not distinctly recollecting the scene through which she had passed, nor cognizant of the situation in which it left her. Her face and brow were almost purple with the rush of blood. They whitened, however, by and by, and for some time retained this death-like hue. She put her hand to her forehead, with a gesture that made me forcibly conscious of an intense and living pain there. Her glance, wandering wildly to and fro, passed over me several times without appearing to inform her of my presence. But finally a look of recognition gleamed from her eyes into mine. "Is it you, Miles Coverdale?" said she, smiling. "Ah, I perceive what you are about. You are turning this whole affair into a ballad. Pray let me hear as many stanzas as you happen to have ready." "Oh, hush, Zenobia!" I answered. "Heaven knows what an ache is in my soul." "It is genuine tragedy, is it not?" rejoined Zenobia, with a sharp, light laugh. "And you are willing to allow, perhaps, that I have had hard measure? But it is a woman's doom, and I have deserved it like a woman. So let there be no pity, as, on my part, there shall be no complaint. It is all right now, or will shortly be so. But, Mr. Coverdale, by all means write this ballad, and put your soul's ache into it, and turn your sympathy to good account, as other poets do, and as poets must, unless they choose to give us glittering icicles instead of lines of fire. As for the moral, it shall be distilled into the final stanza, in a drop of bitter honey." "What shall it be, Zenobia?" I inquired, endeavoring to fall in with her mood. "Oh, a very old one will serve the purpose," she replied. "There are no new truths, much as we have prided ourselves on finding some. A moral? Why, this: that in the battlefield of life the downright stroke, that would fall only on a man's steel headpiece, is sure to light on a woman's heart, over which she wears no breastplate, and whose wisdom it is, therefore, to keep out of the conflict. Or this: that the whole universe, her own sex and yours, and Providence or Destiny to boot, make common cause against the woman who swerves one hair's breadth out of the beaten track. Yes, and add, for I may as well own it now, that with that one hair's breadth she goes all astray, and never sees the world in its true aspect afterwards." "This last is too stern a moral," I observed. "Cannot we soften it a little?" "Do it, if you like, at your own peril, not on my responsibility," she answered. Then, with a sudden change of subject, she went on: "After all, he has flung away what would have served him better than the poor, pale flower he kept. What can Priscilla do for him? Put passionate warmth into his heart when it shall be chilled with frozen hopes? Strengthen his hands when they are weary with much doing and no performance? No, but only tend towards him with a blind, instinctive love, and hang her little, puny weakness for a clog upon his arm. She cannot even give him such sympathy as is worth the name; for will he never, in many an hour of darkness, need that proud intellectual sympathy which he might have had from me, the sympathy that would flash light along his course, and guide as well as cheer him? Poor Hollingsworth! Where will he find it now?" "Hollingsworth has a heart of ice," said I, bitterly. "He is a wretch." "Do him no wrong," interrupted Zenobia, turning haughtily upon me. "Presume not to estimate a man like Hollingsworth. It was my fault all along, and none of his. I see it now. He never sought me. Why should he seek me? What had I to offer him? A miserable, bruised, and battered heart, spoilt long before he met me. A life, too, hopelessly entangled with a villain's. He did well to cast me off. God be praised, he did it! And yet, had he trusted me, and borne with me a little longer, I would have saved him all this trouble." She was silent for a time, and stood with her eyes fixed on the ground. Again raising them, her look was more mild and calm. "Miles Coverdale," said she. "Well, Zenobia," I responded, "can I do you any service?" "Very little," she replied; "but it is my purpose, as you may well imagine, to remove from Blithedale, and most likely I may not see Hollingsworth again. A woman in my position, you understand, feels scarcely at her ease among former friends. New faces, unaccustomed looks, those only can she tolerate. She would pine among familiar scenes; she would be apt to blush, too, under the eyes that knew her secret. Her heart might throb uncomfortably. She would mortify herself, I suppose, with foolish notions of having sacrificed the honor of her sex at the foot of proud, contumacious man. Poor womanhood, with its rights and wrongs! Here will be new matter for my course of lectures, at the idea of which you smiled, Mr. Coverdale, a month or two ago. But as you have really a heart and sympathies, as far as they go, and as I shall depart without seeing Hollingsworth, I must entreat you to be a messenger between him and me." "Willingly," said I, wondering at the strange way in which her mind seemed to vibrate from the deepest earnest to mere levity. "What is the message?" "True, what is it?" exclaimed Zenobia. "After all, I hardly know. On better consideration, I have no message. Tell him something pretty and pathetic, that will come nicely and sweetly into your ballad. Anything you please, so it be tender and submissive enough. Tell him he has murdered me. Tell him that I'll haunt him." She spoke these words with the wildest energy. "And give him no, give Priscilla this." Thus saying, she took the jewelled flower out of her hair, and it struck me as the act of a queen, when worsted in combat, discrowning herself, as if she found a sort of relief in abasing all her pride. "Bid her wear this for Zenobia's sake," she continued. "She is a pretty little creature, and will make as soft and gentle a wife as the veriest Bluebeard could desire. Pity that she must fade so soon; these delicate and puny maidens always do. 10 years hence, let Hollingsworth look at my face and Priscilla's, and then choose betwixt them. Or, if he pleases, let him do it now." How magnificently Zenobia looked as she said this! The effect of her beauty was even heightened by the over consciousness and self recognition of it, into which, I suppose, Hollingsworth's scorn had driven her. She understood the look of admiration in my face, and, Zenobia to the last, it gave her pleasure. "It is an endless pity," said she, "that I had not bethought myself of winning your heart, Mr. Coverdale, instead of Hollingsworth's. I think I should have succeeded, and many women would have deemed you the worthier conquest of the two. You are certainly much the handsomest man. But there is a fate in these things; and beauty in a man has been of little account with me since my earliest girlhood, when, for once, it turned my head. Now, farewell." "Zenobia, whither are you going?" I asked. "No matter where," said she. "But I am weary of this place, and sick to death of playing at philanthropy and progress. Of all varieties of mock life, we have surely blundered into the very emptiest mockery in our effort to establish the one true system. I have done with it, and Blithedale must find another woman to superintend the laundry, and you, Mr. Coverdale, another nurse to make your gruel, the next time you fall ill. It was indeed a foolish dream. Yet it gave us some pleasant summer days and bright hopes while they lasted. It can do no more, nor will it avail us to shed tears over a broken bubble. Here is my hand. Adieu." She gave me her hand with the same free, whole-souled gesture as on the first afternoon of our acquaintance, and, being greatly moved, I bethought me of no better method of expressing my deep sympathy than to carry it to my lips. In so doing, I perceived that this white hand, so hospitably warm when I first touched it 5 months since, was now cold as a veritable piece of snow. "How very cold!" I exclaimed, holding it between both my own, with the vain idea of warming it. "What can be the reason? It is really deathlike." "The extremities die first, they say," answered Zenobia, laughing. "And so you kiss this poor, despised, rejected hand! Well, my dear friend, I thank you. You have reserved your homage for the fallen. Lip of man will never touch my hand again. I intend to become a Catholic, for the sake of going into a nunnery. When you next hear of Zenobia, her face will be behind the black veil, so look your last at it now, for all is over. Once more, farewell." She withdrew her hand, yet left a lingering pressure, which I felt long afterwards. So intimately connected as I had been with perhaps the only man in whom she was ever truly interested, Zenobia looked on me as the representative of all the past, and was conscious that in bidding me adieu, she likewise took final leave of Hollingsworth and of this whole epoch of her life. Never did her beauty shine out more lustrously than in the last glimpse that I had of her. She departed, and was soon hidden among the trees. But whether it was the strong impression of the foregoing scene, or whatever else the cause, I was affected with a fantasy that Zenobia had not actually gone, but was still hovering about the spot and haunting it. I seemed to feel her eyes upon me. It was as if the vivid coloring of her character had left a brilliant stain upon the air. By degrees, however, the impression grew less distinct. I flung myself upon the fallen leaves at the base of Eliot's pulpit. The sunshine withdrew up the tree trunks, and flickered on the topmost boughs. Gray twilight made the wood obscure. The stars brightened out. The pendant boughs became wet with chill autumnal dews. But I was listless, worn out with emotion on my own behalf and sympathy for others, and had no heart to leave my comfortless lair beneath the rock. I must have fallen asleep and had a dream, all the circumstances of which utterly vanished at the moment when they converged to some tragical catastrophe, and thus grew too powerful for the thin sphere of slumber that enveloped them. Starting from the ground, I found the risen moon shining upon the rugged face of the rock, and myself all in a tremble. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of the Blithedale Romance. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Chapter 27. Midnight. It could not have been far from midnight when I came beneath Hollingsworth's window, and, finding it open, flung in a tuft of grass with earth at the roots, and heard it fall upon the floor. He was either awake or sleeping very lightly, for scarcely a moment had gone by before he looked out and discerned me standing in the moonlight. "Is it you, Coverdale?" he asked. "What is the matter?" "Come down to me, Hollingsworth," I answered. "I am anxious to speak with you." The strange tone of my own voice startled me, and him probably no less. He lost no time, and soon issued from the house door, with his dress half arranged. "Again, what is the matter?" he asked impatiently. "Have you seen Zenobia," said I, "since you parted from her at Eliot's pulpit?" "No," answered Hollingsworth, "nor did I expect it." His voice was deep, but had a tremor in it. Hardly had he spoken, when Silas Foster thrust his head, done up in a cotton handkerchief, out of another window, and took what he called, as it literally was, a squint at us. "Well, folks, what are ye about here?" he demanded. "Aha! Are you there, Miles Coverdale? You have been turning night into day since you left us, I reckon; and so you find it quite natural to come prowling about the house at this time o' night, frightening my old woman out of her wits, and making her disturb a tired man out of his best nap. In with you, you vagabond, and to bed." "Dress yourself quickly, Foster," said I. "We want your assistance." I could not, for the life of me, keep that strange tone out of my voice. Silas Foster, obtuse as were his sensibilities, seemed to feel the ghastly earnestness that was conveyed in it, as well as Hollingsworth did. He immediately withdrew his head, and I heard him yawning, muttering to his wife, and again yawning heavily, while he hurried on his clothes. Meanwhile I showed Hollingsworth a delicate handkerchief, marked with a well known cipher, and told him where I found it, and other circumstances which had filled me with a suspicion so terrible that I left him, if he dared, to shape it out for himself. By the time my brief explanation was finished, we were joined by Silas Foster, in his blue woollen frock. "Well, boys," cried he peevishly, "what is to pay now?" "Tell him, Hollingsworth," said I. Hollingsworth shivered perceptibly, and drew in a hard breath betwixt his teeth. He steadied himself, however, and looking the matter more firmly in the face than I had done, explained to Foster my suspicions, and the grounds of them, with a distinctness from which, in spite of my utmost efforts, my words had swerved aside. The tough nerved yeoman, in his comment, put a finish on the business, and brought out the hideous idea in its full terror, as if he were removing the napkin from the face of a corpse. "And so you think she's drowned herself?" he cried. I turned away my face. "What on earth should the young woman do that for?" exclaimed Silas, his eyes half out of his head with mere surprise. "Why, she has more means than she can use or waste, and lacks nothing to make her comfortable but a husband, and that's an article she could have any day. There's some mistake about this, I tell you." "Come," said I, shuddering, "let us go and ascertain the truth." "Well, well," answered Silas Foster, "just as you say. We'll take the long pole with the hook at the end that serves to get the bucket out of the draw well when the rope is broken. With that and a couple of long handled hay rakes, I'll answer for finding her, if she's anywhere to be found. Strange enough! Zenobia drown herself! No, no, I don't believe it. She had too much sense, and too much means, and enjoyed life a great deal too well." When our few preparations were completed, we hastened, by a shorter than the customary route, through fields and pastures, and across a portion of the meadow, to the particular spot on the river bank which I had paused to contemplate in the course of my afternoon's ramble. A nameless presentiment had again drawn me thither, after leaving Eliot's pulpit. I showed my companions where I had found the handkerchief, and pointed to 2 or 3 footsteps impressed into the clayey margin, and tending towards the water. Beneath its shallow verge, among the water weeds, there were further traces, as yet unobliterated by the sluggish current, which was there almost at a standstill. Silas Foster thrust his face down close to these footsteps, and picked up a shoe that had escaped my observation, being half imbedded in the mud. "There's a kid shoe that never was made on a Yankee last," observed he. "I know enough of shoemaker's craft to tell that. French manufacture, and see what a high instep, and how evenly she trod in it. There never was a woman that stepped handsomer in her shoes than Zenobia did. Here," he added, addressing Hollingsworth, "would you like to keep the shoe?" Hollingsworth started back. "Give it to me, Foster," said I. I dabbled it in the water to rinse off the mud, and have kept it ever since. Not far from this spot lay an old leaky punt drawn up on the oozy river side, and generally half full of water. It served the angler to go in quest of pickerel, or the sportsman to pick up his wild ducks. Setting this crazy bark afloat, I seated myself in the stern with the paddle, while Hollingsworth sat in the bows with the hooked pole, and Silas Foster amidships with a hay-rake. "It puts me in mind of my young days," remarked Silas, "when I used to steal out of bed to go bobbing for hornpouts and eels. Hey ho! Well, life and death together make sad work for us all. Then I was a boy, bobbing for fish; and now I am getting to be an old fellow, and here I be, groping for a dead body. I tell you what, lads, if I thought anything had really happened to Zenobia, I should feel kind o' sorrowful." "I wish, at least, you would hold your tongue," muttered I. The moon that night, though past the full, was still large and oval, and having risen between 8 and 9 o'clock, now shone aslantwise over the river, throwing the high opposite bank, with its woods, into deep shadow, but lighting up the hither shore pretty effectually. Not a ray appeared to fall on the river itself. It lapsed imperceptibly away, a broad, black, inscrutable depth, keeping its own secrets from the eye of man as impenetrably as mid ocean could. "Well, Miles Coverdale," said Foster, "you are the helmsman. How do you mean to manage this business?" "I shall let the boat drift, broadside foremost, past that stump," I replied. "I know the bottom, having sounded it in fishing. The shore on this side, after the first step or two, goes off very abruptly, and there is a pool just by that stump 12 or 15 feet deep. The current could not have force enough to sweep any sunken object, even if partially buoyant, out of that hollow." "Come, then," said Silas. "But I doubt whether I can touch bottom with this hay-rake, if it's as deep as you say. Mr. Hollingsworth, I think you'll be the lucky man to night, such luck as it is." We floated past the stump. Silas Foster plied his rake manfully, poking it as far as he could into the water, and immersing the whole length of his arm besides. Hollingsworth at first sat motionless, with the hooked pole elevated in the air; but by and by, with a nervous and jerky movement, he began to plunge it into the blackness that upbore us, setting his teeth, and making precisely such thrusts, methought, as if he were stabbing at a deadly enemy. I bent over the side of the boat. So obscure, however, so awfully mysterious was that dark stream, that, and the thought made me shiver like a leaf, I might as well have tried to look into the enigma of the eternal world, to discover what had become of Zenobia's soul, as into the river depths to find her body. And there perhaps she lay, with her face upward, while the shadow of the boat, and my own pale face peering downward, passed slowly betwixt her and the sky. Once, twice, thrice, I paddled the boat upstream, and again suffered it to glide, with the river's slow, funereal motion, downward. Silas Foster had raked up a large mass of stuff, which, as it came towards the surface, looked somewhat like a flowing garment, but proved to be a monstrous tuft of water weeds. Hollingsworth, with a gigantic effort, upheaved a sunken log. When once free of the bottom, it rose partly out of water, all weedy and slimy, a devilish-looking object which the moon had not shone upon for 100 years, then plunged again, and sullenly returned to its old resting place for the remnant of the century. "That looked ugly," quoth Silas. "I half thought it was the Evil One, on the same errand as ourselves, searching for Zenobia." "He shall never get her," said I, giving the boat a strong impulse. "That's not for you to say, my boy," retorted the yeoman. "Pray God he never has, and never may. Slow work this, however. I should really be glad to find something. Pshaw! What a notion that is, when the only good luck would be to paddle, and drift, and poke, and grope hereabouts till morning, and have our labor for our pains. For my part, I shouldn't wonder if the creature had only lost her shoe in the mud, and saved her soul alive, after all. My stars! How she will laugh at us to morrow morning!" It is indescribable what an image of Zenobia at the breakfast table, full of warmth and mirthful life, this surmise of Silas Foster's brought before my mind. The terrible phantasm of her death was thrown by it into the remotest and dimmest background, where it seemed to grow as improbable as a myth. "Yes, Silas, it may be as you say," cried I. The drift of the stream had again borne us a little below the stump, when I felt, yes, felt, for it was as if the iron hook had smote my breast, felt Hollingsworth's pole strike some object at the bottom of the river. He started up, and almost overset the boat. "Hold on!" cried Foster. "You have her!" Putting a fury of strength into the effort, Hollingsworth heaved amain, and up came a white swash to the surface of the river. It was the flow of a woman's garments. A little higher, and we saw her dark hair streaming down the current. Black river of death, thou hadst yielded up thy victim. Zenobia was found. Silas Foster laid hold of the body. Hollingsworth likewise grappled with it, and I steered towards the bank, gazing all the while at Zenobia, whose limbs were swaying in the current close at the boat's side. Arriving near the shore, we all three stepped into the water, bore her out, and laid her on the ground beneath a tree. "Poor child!" cried Foster, and his dry old heart, I verily believe, vouchsafed a tear. "I'm sorry for her." Were I to describe the perfect horror of the spectacle, the reader might justly reckon it to me for a sin and shame. For more than 12 long years I have borne it in my memory, and could now reproduce it as freshly as if it were still before my eyes. Of all modes of death, methinks it is the ugliest. Her wet garments swathed limbs of terrible inflexibility. She was the marble image of a death agony. Her arms had grown rigid in the act of struggling, and were bent before her with clenched hands. Her knees, too, were bent, and, thank God for it, in the attitude of prayer. Ah, that rigidity! It is impossible to bear the terror of it. It seemed I must needs impart so much of my own miserable idea it seemed as if her body must keep the same position in the coffin, and that her skeleton would keep it in the grave, and that when Zenobia rose at the day of judgment, it would be in just the same attitude as now. One hope I had, and that, too, was mingled half with fear. She knelt as if in prayer. With the last choking consciousness, her soul, bubbling out through her lips, it may be, had given itself up to the Father, reconciled and penitent. But her arms, they were bent before her, as if she struggled against Providence in never ending hostility. Her hands, they were clenched in immitigable defiance. Away with the hideous thought! The flitting moment after Zenobia sank into the dark pool, when her breath was gone and her soul at her lips, was as long, in its capacity of God's infinite forgiveness, as the lifetime of the world. Foster bent over the body, and carefully examined it. "You have wounded the poor thing's breast," said he to Hollingsworth. "Close by her heart, too." "Ha!" cried Hollingsworth with a start. And so he had, indeed, both before and after death. "See," said Foster, "that's the place where the iron struck her. It looks cruelly, but she never felt it." He endeavored to arrange the arms of the corpse decently by its side. His utmost strength, however, scarcely sufficed to bring them down, and rising again the next instant, they bade him defiance, exactly as before. He made another effort with the same result. "In God's name, Silas Foster," cried I with bitter indignation, "let that dead woman alone!" "Why, man, it's not decent," answered he, staring at me in amazement. "I can't bear to see her looking so. Well, well," added he, after a third effort, "'tis of no use, sure enough, and we must leave the women to do their best with her after we get to the house. The sooner that's done, the better." We took 2 rails from a neighboring fence, and formed a bier by laying across some boards from the bottom of the boat. and thus we bore Zenobia homeward. 6 hours before, how beautiful! At midnight, what a horror! A reflection occurs to me that will show ludicrously, I doubt not, on my page, but must come in for its sterling truth. Being the woman that she was, could Zenobia have foreseen all these ugly circumstances of death, how ill it would become her, the altogether unseemly aspect which she must put on, and especially old Silas Foster's efforts to improve the matter, she would no more have committed the dreadful act than have exhibited herself to a public assembly in a badly fitting garment. Zenobia, I have often thought, was not quite simple in her death. She had seen pictures, I suppose, of drowned persons in lithe and graceful attitudes; and she deemed it well and decorous to die as so many village maidens have, wronged in their first love, and seeking peace in the bosom of the old familiar stream, so familiar that they could not dread it, where in childhood they used to bathe their little feet, wading mid-leg deep, unmindful of wet skirts. But in Zenobia's case there was some tint of the Arcadian affectation that had been visible enough in all our lives for a few months past. This, however, to my conception, takes nothing from the tragedy; for has not the world come to an awfully sophisticated pass, when, after a certain degree of acquaintance with it, we cannot even put ourselves to death in whole-hearted simplicity? Slowly, slowly, with many a dreary pause, resting the bier often on some rock, or balancing it across a mossy log to take fresh hold, we bore our burden onward through the moonlight, and at last laid Zenobia on the floor of the old farmhouse. By and by came 3 or 4 withered women, and stood whispering around the corpse, peering at it through their spectacles, holding up their skinny hands, shaking their night-capped heads, and taking counsel of one another's experience what was to be done. With those tirewomen we left Zenobia. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of the Blithedale Romance. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Chapter 28. Blithedale Pasture. Blithedale, thus far in its progress, had never found the necessity of a burial ground. There was some consultation among us in what spot Zenobia might most fitly be laid. It was my own wish that she should sleep at the base of Eliot's pulpit, and that on the rugged front of the rock, the name by which we familiarly knew her, Zenobia, and not another word, should be deeply cut, and left for the moss and lichens to fill up at their long leisure. But Hollingsworth, to whose ideas on this point great deference was due, made it his request that her grave might be dug on the gently sloping hillside in the wide pasture, where, as we once supposed, Zenobia and he had planned to build their cottage. And thus it was done accordingly. She was buried very much as other people have been for hundreds of years gone by. In anticipation of death, we Blithedale colonists had sometimes set our fancies at work to arrange a funereal ceremony, which should be the proper symbolic expression of our spiritual faith and eternal hopes; and this we meant to substitute for those customary rites which were molded originally out of the Gothic gloom, and by long use, like an old velvet pall, have so much more than their first death smell in them. But when the occasion came, we found it the simplest and truest thing, after all, to content ourselves with the old fashion, taking away what we could, but interpolating no novelties, and particularly avoiding all frippery of flowers and cheerful emblems. The procession moved from the farmhouse. Nearest the dead walked an old man in deep mourning, his face mostly concealed in a white handkerchief, and with Priscilla leaning on his arm. Hollingsworth and myself came next. We all stood around the narrow niche in the cold earth; all saw the coffin lowered in; all heard the rattle of the crumbly soil upon its lid, that final sound which mortality awakens on the utmost verge of sense, as if in the vain hope of bringing an echo from the spiritual world. I noticed a stranger to most of those present, though known to me, who, after the coffin had descended, took up a handful of earth and flung it first into the grave. I had given up Hollingsworth's arm, and now found myself near this man. "It was an idle thing, a foolish thing for Zenobia to do," said he. "She was the last woman in the world to whom death could have been necessary. It was too absurd. I have no patience with her." "Why so?" I inquired, smothering my horror at his cold comment, in my eager curiosity to discover some tangible truth as to his relation with Zenobia. If any crisis could justify the sad wrong she offered to herself, it was surely that in which she stood. Everything had failed her, prosperity in the world's sense, for her opulence was gone, the heart's prosperity in love. And there was a secret burden on her, the nature of which is best known to you. Young as she was, she had tried life fully, had no more to hope, and something, perhaps, to fear. Had Providence taken her away in its own holy hand, I should have thought it the kindest dispensation that could be awarded to one so wrecked. "You mistake the matter completely," rejoined Westervelt. "What, then, is your own view of it?" I asked. "Her mind was active, and various in its powers," said he. "Her heart had a manifold adaptation, her constitution an infinite buoyancy, which, had she possessed only a little patience to await the reflux of her troubles, would have borne her upward triumphantly for 20 years to come. Her beauty would not have waned, or scarcely so, and surely not beyond the reach of art to restore it, in all that time. She had life's summer all before her, and 100 varieties of brilliant success. What an actress Zenobia might have been! It was one of her least valuable capabilities. How forcibly she might have wrought upon the world, either directly in her own person, or by her influence upon some man, or a series of men, of controlling genius! Every prize that could be worth a woman's having, and many prizes which other women are too timid to desire, lay within Zenobia's reach. In all this, I observed, there would have been nothing to satisfy her heart. "Her heart," answered Westervelt contemptuously. "That troublesome organ, as she had hitherto found it, would have been kept in its due place and degree, and have had all the gratification it could fairly claim. She would soon have established a control over it. Love had failed her, you say? Had it never failed her before? Yet she survived it, and loved again, possibly not once alone, nor twice either. And now to drown herself for yonder dreamy philanthropist!" "Who are you," I exclaimed indignantly, "that dare to speak thus of the dead? You seem to intend a eulogy, yet leave out whatever was noblest in her, and blacken while you mean to praise. I have long considered you as Zenobia's evil fate. Your sentiments confirm me in the idea, but leave me still ignorant as to the mode in which you have influenced her life. The connection may have been indissoluble, except by death. Then, indeed, always in the hope of God's infinite mercy, I cannot deem it a misfortune that she sleeps in yonder grave." "No matter what I was to her," he answered gloomily, yet without actual emotion. "She is now beyond my reach. Had she lived, and hearkened to my counsels, we might have served each other well. But there Zenobia lies in yonder pit, with the dull earth over her. 20 years of a brilliant lifetime thrown away for a mere woman's whim. Heaven deal with Westervelt according to his nature and deserts, that is to say, annihilate him. He was altogether earthy, worldly, made for time and its gross objects, and incapable, except by a sort of dim reflection caught from other minds, of so much as one spiritual idea. Whatever stain Zenobia had was caught from him, nor does it seldom happen that a character of admirable qualities loses its better life because the atmosphere that should sustain it is rendered poisonous by such breath as this man mingled with Zenobia's. Yet his reflections possessed their share of truth. It was a woeful thought that a woman of Zenobia's diversified capacity should have fancied herself irretrievably defeated on the broad battlefield of life, and with no refuge save to fall on her own sword, merely because love had gone against her. It is nonsense, and a miserable wrong, the result, like so many others, of masculine egotism, that the success or failure of woman's existence should be made to depend wholly on the affections, and on one species of affection, while man has such a multitude of other chances that this seems but an incident. For its own sake, if it will do no more, the world should throw open all its avenues to the passport of a woman's bleeding heart. As we stood around the grave, I looked often towards Priscilla, dreading to see her wholly overcome with grief. And deeply grieved, in truth, she was. But a character so simply constituted as hers has room only for a single predominant affection. No other feeling can touch the heart's inmost core, nor do it any deadly mischief. Thus, while we see that such a being responds to every breeze with tremulous vibration, and imagine that she must be shattered by the first rude blast, we find her retaining her equilibrium amid shocks that might have overthrown many a sturdier frame. So with Priscilla. Her one possible misfortune was Hollingsworth's unkindness, and that was destined never to befall her. Never yet, at least, for Priscilla has not died. But Hollingsworth! After all the evil that he did, are we to leave him thus, blessed with the entire devotion of this one true heart, and with wealth at his disposal to execute the long contemplated project that had led him so far astray? What retribution is there here? My mind being vexed with precisely this query, I made a journey, some years since, for the sole purpose of catching a last glimpse of Hollingsworth, and judging for myself whether he were a happy man or no. I learned that he inhabited a small cottage, that his way of life was exceedingly retired, and that my only chance of encountering him or Priscilla was to meet them in a secluded lane, where, in the latter part of the afternoon, they were accustomed to walk. I did meet them accordingly. As they approached me, I observed in Hollingsworth's face a depressed and melancholy look that seemed habitual. The powerfully built man showed a self-distrustful weakness, and a childlike or childish tendency to press close, and closer still, to the side of the slender woman whose arm was within his. In Priscilla's manner there was a protective and watchful quality, as if she felt herself the guardian of her companion; but likewise a deep, submissive, unquestioning reverence, and also a veiled happiness in her fair and quiet countenance. Drawing nearer, Priscilla recognized me, and gave me a kind and friendly smile, but with a slight gesture which I could not help interpreting as an entreaty not to make myself known to Hollingsworth. Nevertheless, an impulse took possession of me, and compelled me to address him. "I have come, Hollingsworth," said I, "to view your grand edifice for the reformation of criminals. Is it finished yet?" "No, nor begun," answered he, without raising his eyes. "A very small one answers all my purposes." Priscilla threw me an upbraiding glance; but I spoke again, with a bitter and revengeful emotion, as if flinging a poisoned arrow at Hollingsworth's heart. "Up to this moment," I inquired, "how many criminals have you reformed?" "Not one," said Hollingsworth, with his eyes still fixed on the ground. "Ever since we parted, I have been busy with a single murderer." Then the tears gushed into my eyes, and I forgave him; for I remembered the wild energy, the passionate shriek with which Zenobia had spoken those words, "Tell him he has murdered me! Tell him that I'll haunt him!" and I knew what murderer he meant, and whose vindictive shadow dogged the side where Priscilla was not. The moral which presents itself to my reflections, as drawn from Hollingsworth's character and errors, is simply this: that, admitting what is called philanthropy, when adopted as a profession, to be often useful, by its energetic impulse, to society at large, it is perilous to the individual whose ruling passion, in one exclusive channel, it thus becomes. It ruins, or is fearfully apt to ruin, the heart, the rich juices of which God never meant should be pressed violently out and distilled into alcoholic liquor by an unnatural process, but should render life sweet, bland, and gently beneficent, and insensibly influence other hearts and other lives to the same blessed end. I see in Hollingsworth an exemplification of the most awful truth in Bunyan's book of such: "From the very gate of heaven there is a byway to the pit." But all this while we have been standing by Zenobia's grave. I have never since beheld it, but make no question that the grass grew all the better on that little parallelogram of pasture land for the decay of the beautiful woman who slept beneath. How Nature seems to love us! And how readily, nevertheless, without a sigh or a complaint, she converts us to a meaner purpose, when her highest one, that of a conscious intellectual life and sensibility, has been untimely balked. While Zenobia lived, Nature was proud of her, and directed all eyes upon that radiant presence as her fairest handiwork. Zenobia perished. Will not Nature shed a tear? Ah, no! She adopts the calamity at once into her system, and is just as well pleased, for aught we can see, with the tuft of ranker vegetation that grew out of Zenobia's heart, as with all the beauty which has bequeathed us no earthly representative, except in this crop of weeds. It is because the spirit is inestimable that the lifeless body is so little valued. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of the Blithedale Romance. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Chapter 29. Miles Coverdale's Confession. It remains only to say a few words about myself. Not improbably, the reader might be willing to spare me the trouble, for I have made but a poor and dim figure in my own narrative, establishing no separate interest, and suffering my colorless life to take its hue from other lives. But one still retains some little consideration for oneself, so I keep these last 2 or 3 pages for my individual and sole behoof. But what, after all, have I to tell? Nothing, nothing, nothing. I left Blithedale within the week after Zenobia's death, and went back thither no more. The whole soil of our farm, for a long time afterwards, seemed but the sodded earth over her grave. I could not toil there, nor live upon its products. Often, however, in these years that are darkening around me, I remember our beautiful scheme of a noble and unselfish life, and how fair in that first summer appeared the prospect that it might endure for generations, and be perfected, as the ages rolled away, into the system of a people and a world. Were my former associates now there, were there only 3 or 4 of those true-hearted men still laboring in the sun, I sometimes fancy that I should direct my world-weary footsteps thitherward, and entreat them to receive me for old friendship's sake. More and more I feel that we had struck upon what ought to be a truth. Posterity may dig it up, and profit by it. The experiment, so far as its original projectors were concerned, proved long ago a failure, first lapsing into Fourierism, and dying, as it well deserved, for this infidelity to its own higher spirit. Where once we toiled with our whole hopeful hearts, the town paupers, aged, nerveless, and disconsolate, creep sluggishly afield. Alas, what faith is requisite to bear up against such results of generous effort! My subsequent life has passed, I was going to say happily, but at all events tolerably enough. I am now at middle age, well, a step or two beyond the midmost point, and I care not a fig who knows it. A bachelor, with no very decided purpose of ever being otherwise. I have been twice to Europe, and spent a year or two rather agreeably at each visit. Being well to do in the world, and having nobody but myself to care for, I live very much at my ease, and fare sumptuously every day. As for poetry, I have given it up, notwithstanding that Dr. Griswold, as the reader of course knows, has placed me at a fair elevation among our minor minstrelsy, on the strength of my pretty little volume published 10 years ago. As regards human progress, in spite of my irrepressible yearnings over the Blithedale reminiscences, let them believe in it who can, and aid in it who choose. If I could earnestly do either, it might be all the better for my comfort. As Hollingsworth once told me, I lack a purpose. How strange! He was ruined morally by an overplus of the very same ingredient, the want of which, I occasionally suspect, has rendered my own life all an emptiness. I by no means wish to die; yet were there any cause in this whole chaos of human struggle worth a sane man's dying for, and which my death would benefit, then, provided, however, the effort did not involve an unreasonable amount of trouble, methinks I might be bold to offer up my life. If Kossuth, for example, would pitch the battlefield of Hungarian rights within an easy ride of my abode, and choose a mild, sunny morning after breakfast for the conflict, Miles Coverdale would gladly be his man for one brave rush upon the levelled bayonets. Further than that, I should be loath to pledge myself. I exaggerate my own defects. The reader must not take my own word for it, nor believe me altogether changed from the young man who once hoped strenuously, and struggled not so much amiss. Frostier heads than mine have gained honor in the world; frostier hearts have imbibed new warmth, and been newly happy. Life, however, it must be owned, has come to a rather idle pass with me. Would my friends like to know what brought it thither? There is one secret I have concealed it all along, and never meant to let the least whisper of it escape one foolish little secret, which possibly may have had something to do with these inactive years of meridian manhood, with my bachelorship, with the unsatisfied retrospect that I fling back on life, and my listless glance towards the future. Shall I reveal it? It is an absurd thing for a man in his afternoon, a man of the world, moreover, with these 3 white hairs in his brown mustache, and that deepening track of a crow's foot on each temple, an absurd thing ever to have happened, and quite the absurdest for an old bachelor like me to talk about. But it rises to my throat, so let it come. I perceive, moreover, that the confession, brief as it shall be, will throw a gleam of light over my behavior throughout the foregoing incidents, and is indeed essential to the full understanding of my story. The reader, therefore, since I have disclosed so much, is entitled to this one word more. As I write it, he will charitably suppose me to blush, and turn away my face. I myself, was in love with Priscilla. End of chapter 29. End of The Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne.